Finally surrounded, the Spanish king Charles IV, as well as his son Ferdinand VII, were forced to abdicate their claims to the crown, and Napoleon installed his own brother Joseph as King of Spain. The whole of Spain now erupted into rebellion, and cities were in flames everywhere. Guerrilla warfare broke out throughout the countryside and was instrumental in tying down and demoralizing French troops that were sorely needed elsewhere. Portugal, seeing another chance at freedom, soon exploded into open revolt against France as well. By mid-1808, the Peninsular War, as it is now known, was in full motion. Napoleon's armies had suffered their first substantial defeats and had surrendered 5 ships of the line along with an entire French army corps to the Spanish. These victories signalled that the French were beatable and reverberated throughout Europe, forming the seed of the next anti-Napoleon coalition. By August of 1808, British troops under the command of the Duke of Wellington had landed in Portugal and began reinforcing Portuguese and Spanish forces. Not to be outdone, Napoleon ordered tens of thousands more troops into the fray, clawing back one city after another, only to lose them again. Eventually, they began to recapture much of southern Spain, forcing the patriotic forces to hole up in Cadiz, an unassailable fortress that was now reinforced by the British Royal Navy in its harbour. From here, the remnant Regency Council, or junta, plotted its overthrow of Joseph and the reinstallation of the rightful king, either Charles IV or his son, Ferdinand VII. The next 3 years saw 500,000 soldiers slogging it out in battle after battle, campaign after campaign, across the entire Iberian Peninsula, with burning, looting and pillaging causing a catastrophic collapse of the entire Spanish economy and infrastructure. The Spanish court, and even ordinary citizens, were torn between the patriots and the Francophiles, and a civil war that made the murders and horror of Franco's 1936 civil war pale in significance. By the end of 1812, Napoleon had been entirely distracted by the disaster of his Russian campaign, and had left his generals and brother Joseph to deal with what he called the festering sore of the Peninsular War. The attrition now began to shift slowly in favour of the Allies, as by mid-1813 Napoleon was transferring troops from Spain to shore up his position in Eastern Europe, nervous about rebellions in the wake of his catastrophic defeat by the Russian winter. Slowly, Allied gains and French fatigue caused a fighting retreat of the French forces back into France, with King Joseph shamefully being among the first to leave, as the Cadiz junta broke out of its encirclement and gradually re-established control over the Spanish cities. British troops began to be transferred to America to shore up forces fighting against the United States in its ongoing disputes in Canada. With reprisals aplenty, all the afrancesados, or French collaborators as they were termed, who managed to escape with their lives, were exiled to France, but the chaos was far from over. The ruling junta was itself comprised of both the traditional loyalists, who were for a return of the absolute monarchy of the Bourbon and Habsburg dynasties, and those who had a more liberal idea about Spain's future, with a desire for a constitutional monarchy and a well-written constitution to protect the interests of the people. When Napoleon initially deposed Charles and Ferdinand, he also set about reforming the Spanish Parliament along Republican and Enlightenment lines. He abolished church power and made all citizens equal before the law. Perhaps most significantly, he enabled a substantial representation of delegates from the colonies of Latin America and the Philippines, recognizing their aspirations for greater equality and more autonomy. As the war dragged on, many of the sitting deputies saw the benefit of these changes and became convinced that they were worth keeping, some even harbouring Republican aspirations. During its time in Cadiz, the remnant Regency junta reformed its sitting legislature or parliament. It was comprised largely of these progressive delegates, with significantly fewer clergy or conservative voices. Furthermore, the presence of British forces, and hence ideas, in the city also had a shaping influence on the nature of this government in waiting, as long and interesting conversations were had behind the protective walls of the fortress. So it was that a constitution was eventually drafted, being amongst the first of its kind in the world. While it recognised Ferdinand as the legitimate ruler of Spain, it significantly curtailed his power and that of the Church, while vesting ultimate control in ministers of Parliament. It granted citizenship and voting rights to all subjects, even indigenous peoples and mixed-race ones, granting civil rights to free blacks, though not quite abolishing institutional slavery. It also called for a decentralisation of government control and greater self-determination in the dominions. This lean towards federalism, as well as offshore autonomy, now swayed the balance of power in the Parliament away from Spanish paternalism and into the hands of overseas dominions, upon whose resources, trade, and money the Spanish crown now heavily depended. Many of the nobility in the homeland found this distasteful.